You don't have to watch these in order. There's nothing about watching these in order that will make it better or worse. But last week I did talk about the AOH drawing method, and I talked about the difference. We ended after the actual tutorial. We talked a little bit more about how in drawing books like this one, Drawing for the Absolute Beginner, by Mark and Mary Willenbrink, how they will go and they will show you how to draw something. They will give you the steps for how to draw something, and it will always get you from let me get past the perspective stuff and the technique, and then we'll step over here to the instructions. They will take you, the steps will always be like draw a basic steps be like the steps would be like draw a basic shape, add some detail, make it a tree. And the joke is always what happens between there and there. From there to there I get, but what happens from there to there is not always so clear. And it's like that in almost every lesson you see, especially in all the beginners books. Draw a basic shape, add some cut in detail, and then make it a tree, or bricks, or rocks. Draw in some basic shapes, add some detail, make rocks. And the part that they always leave out, or as far as I'm concerned, draw in a basic shape, add some detail, make it a plane. You can see there are steps missing here to get you from here to there. And the steps that are missing are is the shading through the shapes. And last week we talked about AOH. We talked about if you can draw, how you can draw the letters A, O, and H. If you can write your name, if you can somehow fashion the letters A, O, and H, then you can make a triangle, a circle, and a rectangle, or you can make a cone, a sphere, and a column. And if you can do that, then you can make any other shape in the world. And to get you from draw a basic shape to from draw a basic shape to finished product, the part you have to master is, ooh, what happened to the camera? The camera has done something wacky. The part you have to master is shading. And that's the part they don't tell you about. They expect you to pick that up intuitively. I'm going to turn some of these lights off because it's easier with one light to see the shading. I'm not turning all of the lights off. I'm just turning some of the lights off so that you can see the shading. So that you can see the shading easier. Here's a party hat. We're going to start with the letter A. Here's a party hat that I have painted silver, and the reason I painted it silver was I wanted to illustrate how shiny things, the shadows and the reflections on shiny things are sharp and sharp edges, versus things that are not shiny, the edges transition. So your shadows on shiny things are straight solid lines, and your shadows on not shiny things transition to softer because the texture starts casting a shadow on itself before it gets there. But that's a different lesson altogether. We'll do that in a future lesson. What I want you to see today is I want you to see on this cone, if you can see on this cone, that light might be a little too bright, too direct. There may not be any way to stop it. What I want you to see on this cone, there we go. What I want you to see on this cone is I want you to see how you have your direct light on the cone, and then you have your core shadow where the object itself is casting a shadow on itself. It is actually, the object itself is actually blocking the shadow, blocking the light, and causes a core shadow. And then you have a lighter shadow over here where, if the fact that the paper doesn't come up to it, the lighter shadow over here is where the light is, the indirect light is bouncing back. It's still lit, it's just not as lit on this side. So what you have in that shape, see if you can see my silver point. What you have in that shape, and we're going to do it as a cone. I'm watching the screen instead of watching the paper. What you have in that shape is you have this basic cone, right? Which, as we all know, is just an extension of the letter A. You have this basic cone. And let's draw our light source over here so we know our light source is over here. So we know our light source is over here. So we know that our cone, here's our longest part of our cone. So we know that our core shadow on our cone is going to be about right there. And we know that our shadow is going to be rounded because our cone is rounded. So if we take our shading and we go around like this, and we keep it in the shape of the rounded part of the cone, and we keep the core shadow as a smaller shape of the cone itself. See what I'm doing? I'm making a smaller cone inside the cone. I'm making a darker, smaller cone inside the cone. And because our object was shiny, I'm giving it a hard edge. Had our object not been shiny, then the surface itself would have transitioned. So there is our core shadow. Now this side over here was backlit, right? So it's not as bright as this side. The way it is right now, it's just as bright as this side. So we need to shade this side also, but it needs to be a lighter shade than this. So what I like to do is I just like to overlap my shading. And it will darken the shading that's already there, and yet still shade the other side. So what you end up with is you end up with a darker shade here, and a lighter shade here, and then a transition in the middle. You see how that added dimension to it? See how that made it round? And you can add, your eye kind of wants to see this edge. So you can add a little bit on this side if you want to, just to trick your eye, to make your eye think it's really there. It's not really there. If you were really trying to paint what was really there, you almost wouldn't even see this edge. As a matter of fact, if you look at the shiny thing, it's hard to see that edge unless you put something there to break up the light in front of it. It's hard to see that edge. So the other thing to keep in mind is without a shadow on the ground, that thing is just sitting there in space, isn't it? And as we go through these, if you watch future episodes, and again, you don't have to watch them in order, but as you watch future episodes, we're going to talk about how the shapes cast shadow on each other. The thing to remember is that this thing is round and it's casting a shadow. Here's its widest part here, right? Here's its thinnest part. So if you draw a line out from its thinnest part and its widest part, those two points should meet. And from the other side as well. So there's your shadow on the ground, right? And here, from the widest part out, this is the part that's furthest from the light. This part right here is your darkest point. And from that point on, you're going to have reflected light off of your object onto your shadow, because your light is going to bounce off of your surface over here onto here. That's what's causing this reflective light. And you can demonstrate that by putting your hand right there. That's what's causing the light on the other side, is the light bouncing off of the ground behind it. So the light bouncing off behind it and bending around the object cause a reflected light over here, so that it's not quite as dark as this shadow right here. We have the same thing happening on your shadow on the ground. You have the darkest part right here at the corner where it touches, and from there out, it's going to lighten up. Now you see how that shadow goes all the way around your object. And again, you have your core shadow, and then you have your reflected light inside your shadow. And that gives your object depth. Now, in future lessons, like I was saying a while ago, in future lessons, what you'll look at when we do a head, for instance, you'll have your sphere, and then you'll have smaller spheres and you might have cones. And what you have to watch is from your light source how your shadow is going to react on your rounded object, and how your shadows on your rounded objects are going to interact. So by knowing how the light acts on the singular object, it will give you insight as to how the objects are going to interact when you put them together. So when you have a sphere on top of a sphere, and you have your shading on your sphere, which we haven't covered yet, and then you have your shading on this sphere, and you have your shading on this sphere, and your cast shadows, how it will make sense on the paper, how it will get you from draw a shape, add some detail, draw a finished project. The shading is the answer. So that's tonight's $2 tutorial, shading a cylinder, or I'm sorry, shading a cone. Sorry, that's tonight's $2 tutorial, is shading a cone.